Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Tabadlab Live. My name is Dr Zainab Latif and I'm a senior fellow here at Tabadlab. Our session today is entitled Risk and Repair, Equity and Adaptation in a Changing Climate. Tabadlab recently hosted a session which was looking at building a resilient healthcare system in light of the climate emergency. And continuing this conversation, we are here today to talk about urban infrastructure in light of climate repair. Climate repair basically means trying to eliminate or at least reduce some of the human impacts that have worsened the climate change effects that we are today grappling with. And in the urban context, this has huge implications for how we respond, on the one hand, to growing populations, and on the other hand, to unprecedented and enormous magnitude of climate-related disasters. We have with us here today Dr. Nausheen Anwar, who's going to help us discuss this topic. Dr. Anwar is director at Karachi Urban Lab and professor of city and regional planning at IBA Karachi. She's also Urban Climate Resilience Lead and Principal Researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Dr. Anwar, we are thrilled to have you with us, and I offer you a virtual welcome to a very wet and windy Islamabad.
Thank you so much, Zainab. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of this conversation today. I've long admired the kind of work that the Tabadlab does.
Fantastic. So we're here to discuss a paper that you recently co-authored, published by the Institute of Development Studies, entitled The 24-Hour Risk City, a framework for thinking about building infrastructures of climate repair in Nairobi and Karachi. Now, your earlier work looked at gender and violence in urban settings, and you also looked at the political economy of urban repair and maintenance. And I'm very intrigued to hear about your journey. So how did you get from there to coming to the idea of a 24-hour risk city?
Thank you so much. So underlying all my research is my long-standing interest in the urban or in cities, because I'm trained as a city and regional planner. So even in the work on gender and violence, my interest was always in the context of the urban. And the Gender and Violence Project, which actually was funded by the International Development Research Centre, in which a colleague from King's College London and I led a 3-year project which focused on Rawalpindi, Islamabad and Karachi. The backdrop, a very important aspect of that particular project, was the broader backdrop of infrastructure. How do we think of the relationship between infrastructures, the complexity of violence, which is ever-changing, and the dynamics of gender? So the infrastructural aspect remains a very important aspect of my work, of my research, and it is very much center stage in this recent project that we completed when I was at IDS, in collaboration with colleagues in Pakistan, in Karachi specifically, and also in Nairobi. In Nairobi, the work was with the Concrete Design Initiative, colleagues over there that are doing absolutely amazing work on infrastructure upgradation in Nairobi's informal settlements, and then with colleagues over at the Open University. So there is actually no departure as such. The infrastructural lens actually provides a very fruitful and a very rich lens. There could be many, many different entry points in terms of how we have a broader conversation on cities and climate change. So for me, one of the interesting lenses is to kind of dive in through the infrastructure angle, and we did in this particular project, but also taking on board notions of risk, especially the notion of 24-hour risk.
So tell us a little bit about that. So what is the 24-hour risk idea?
So the idea is really about how risk manifests itself both across the spatial and the temporal realms, and that these risks are not only associated with climate change impacts, the risks of flooding or the risks of extreme heat, but that these climate change related risks also dovetail with other kinds of risks that are long-standing risks that are part of the broader canvas of the city, if I may be permitted to use that word. So these would be the risks associated with issues of health, of housing, of poverty, of inequality. And one of the more important issues that we looked at when we looked at issues of risk was evictions or displacement across both cities, such as Nairobi and Karachi. They have a great deal in common, although there are still differences. So So if we just take risk more broadly speaking in terms of its spatial and temporal dimensions and think about how evictions and displacements drive climate change impact associated risks across the temporal and the spatial, then the notion of how risks change across a 24-hour time period in specific locations or part of the city becomes particularly palpable, becomes particularly, it materializes in very complex ways. And the aim and objective was really to be able to say that, look, we can talk about risk along these lines, which is the more traditional way of thinking about risk.
Hmm.
Or climate related risks. But here, what we're trying to show you is that risks have these different kinds of temporal and spatial frames and are far, far more complex in the urban context than we actually give time to think about.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And we're going to talk about sort of what that means for policymakers and decision makers in a little bit. But first, I'd like you to, in addition to this notion of 24-hour risk, your paper also talked about the social study of shade. And that's something that was very intriguing for me. Can you talk a little bit about that and also what that means in the context of these marginalized groups who are living in informal settlements? And also maybe just sort of honing in on what does that really mean for Karachi's context?
So the social study of state is actually part of another project that I was involved with, a mini part of a project that I was involved with for 3 years called Cool Infrastructures, Life with Heat in the Off-Grid City. This was a multi-city project spanning Asia, Africa, and East Asia and Southeast Asia. And one of the things that my colleagues and I were trying to do in that was to really to understand, to get the nitty-gritty of, well, how are people actually coping with extreme heat and what kinds of tools and mechanisms, both active and passive, are people using to mitigate the risk associated with with extreme heat, impacts on their bodies. And heat is a very complex thing. So shade came up as a very important part of the conversation. And in the context of a city like Karachi, if we take it as a proxy really to think about more global challenges as they relate to shade, we noted over a process of 3 years, I mean, we were already aware of the anecdotal conversations that, for instance, tree cover, in a very, very simple sense, in cities like Karachi, is falling and
Mm,
it's disappearing. And with more and more amounts of concrete and asphalt poured into the built environment, uh, for for street vendors, even for people living in low income informal settlements, shade has become, or the right to shade, the social study of shade is also about the right to shade, that shade is an entitlement, it's a right. How can people protect themselves in a daily context? Street vendors, informal workers, construction workers, who are exposed not only to the to the hazards of solar exposure, but also rising temperatures, and not just ambient temperatures, but also those that are related to humidity, where we use the wet bulb globe temperature, the WBGT, which takes extreme heat into consideration. So what we are possibly looking at is that with the lack of shade, people are now increasingly exposed to more hazardous forms of extreme heat. So the idea in this study was also then to look at specific sites in Karachi, especially where climate migrants have settled. And I put rabbit ears
mm,
around those two words because they are controversial terms. Specifically, the people who migrated to Karachi after the 2022 floods. What were the
mm,
kinds of material, social circumstances in which they found themselves, um, vis-a-vis not only healthcare systems or access to healthcare, but also infrastructures. And then shade becomes a very important part of how we think about infrastructures. So the story on infrastructure then keeps getting more and more complex, because another very important aspect of this is not just electricity and water or road systems, but also ventilation. And
mm,
how do you cool? So the social study of shade then has these different kinds of implications, not only for the body, but also for cooling, for food systems. How do you keep food cool in environments that may not have access to 24-hour electricity? How do you keep medicine cool, medicine so that it doesn't expire sooner than its expiry date? And these are very important concerns as we go forward in terms of thinking about the impact of extreme heat in cities like Karachi and elsewhere across the world. Actually, it's not just
mm,
Karachi. The world is warming. There's no place on the planet that is necessarily cooling. So
mm,
these are all important concerns for cities across the world.
mm. I hear you. I know exactly what you're saying, because the way that people are, even just the informal settlements in Islamabad, near where I live, the location of those settlements seems to be changing. So and it changes with the weather. So जब सर्दी ज़्यादा होती है, तो the settlements can really be, I mean, in the open air. But जैसे जैसे गर्मी ज़्यादा होती है, तो जहाँ पे अब वो नए flyovers बन गए हैं, उनके नीचे लोग आबाद हो जाते हैं, and they kind of shift their tents and their sort of dwellings over there. And as insofar as the health system access and the education system access and any urban infrastructure that we should mention, I mean, yeah. So that actually brings me to my next question, which is the infrastructure for cities, governance in general in cities is stressed, to put it mildly, right? It's waning. And in light of those immense pressures, and in light of these catastrophic climate events that are hitting Pakistan, almost on an annual, if not more frequent basis, what does your research suggest for policymakers who are operating in this space, who are tasked with responding both to growing cities and also growing cities in climate-related emergencies?
That's a brilliant question. So, if we are to address policymakers across Pakistan, this would be, of course, across many, many different kinds of institutions, ranging from the federal coming all the way down to the local. Although local in the context of Sindh is a very controversial dynamic.
Yeah.
So, federal governments, the NDMA, the PDMAs, the Environmental Protection Agency, SEPA in Sindh's case, urban planners, engineers. I think that maybe Punjab is faring a little better on this. I mean, we discussed this very briefly when we talked yesterday, that when we think of climate change impacts in Pakistan, it's not a straightforward thing. And when we travel from KPK all the way down to Sindh, we travel to Punjab, we travel to Balochistan, we see that the geographical locations and the socio-cultural histories and material context do complicate the broader conversation on what climate policy should look like. So
Yeah.
the one fix everyone size model may not necessarily work. It may work up to a certain extent, but then it may falter on ground. So this is a long-standing question relating to policy in any case, that policy that tries in any context, whether it's related to inequality or poverty or housing issues and so forth, that when the glove is let's fit everybody into this category, it generally doesn't work. So how do you bring nuance into policy making agendas? I think that this is, historically speaking, one of the biggest challenges. But when we start talking about climate change impacts in relation to infrastructural dynamics and so forth, and long-standing structural dynamics, nuance is what it's all about.
Right.
We position risk then again at the center of this equation. Well, how can policymakers intervene? If I just take extreme heat into consideration, for instance, so our conversations on extreme heat really have not moved beyond a heat risk management plan. And so even when we look at the climate adaptation policy that came out, I think it was a year and a half ago, the way that heat is treated is mostly in terms of temperatures. And then they're linked to some kind of a loose adaptation framework, and there's talk of heat waves, and that's the end of the conversation. But we know that, for those of us who work on extreme heat, we know that heat is a very complex thing. And it's about wind, it's about solar, it's about ambient temperatures, it's about humidity. And then it doesn't stop at the level of heat waves. It goes on in the context of chronic heat also. So in the Karachi Urban Lab, for instance, we've worked on, we took 60 years of data from two data points. There are not many data points across a city like Karachi. There are really three formal ones, but we could only buy from two, and you have to buy the data. And we did a study, we took 60 years of data, and we did a very sophisticated econometric analysis. This was in collaboration with a colleague who's absolutely stupendous seller at doing the data crunching. And what we found was that, we're looking at some pretty serious numbers, especially in terms of nighttime overheating and daytime changes in temperature overall, also taking humidity into consideration. So the question then is that if we are to do when we do this kinds of research, where are the policymakers in terms of engaging with the kind of data that research centers like KUL and many other research centers across Pakistan, although we work in a very grounded fashion, uh, the kind of data that we produce, how can it be taken up? What is the uptake into policymaking agendas that look at longitudinal plans for poverty alleviation, for battling inequality and so forth? These kinds of indicators, urban indicators, are not part of those
Mm.
conversations or even part of the broader data making, policy making agendas. There is a huge lag. So this is one big, and this has an impact on how we think about risk, how we think about resilience, because it has an impact on healthcare systems, on the human body when we think about repair and care, and many, many other. It also directly converges with issues of housing and shelter and shade. So there are so many different prongs, but there is no uptake on this kind of data. There is no, so the conversations are lacking. And once they get stuck on a particular needle, they don't move beyond that.
Mm.
So this is just one example that I'm giving you. I mean, there could be plenty, plenty more that we could delve into.
So Nausheen, thank you. No, if we can think about maybe the top three findings from your research that we can apply to existing infrastructure projects or projects that are going to be coming in the near future. For example, the Gujranala upgradation project. Even when we think about sort of climate resettlement, whenever the next flood happens, subsequent to that, we're going to have resettlements happening, and of course in Karachi as well. Now these things we know, we don't have to imagine a hypothetical. We know this is going to happen. What are the top three things that you would recommend policymakers, whether it's the PDMAs or whether it's the Sindh Environmental Protection Agency, to keep in mind as they develop these plans?
Point number one: when is climate change a red herring, and when isn't it a red herring? And I think that in the context of a city like Karachi, again, if we take it as a proxy to learn about what is good and what is bad,
Yeah.
the upgradation of the city's nalas, which have been for centuries very important natural water channels that lead into the Arabian Sea.
Yeah.
These channels have become clogged with essentially with the nalas have become clogged with waste, and this has been a long-standing issue. And then alongside this, a number of low-income informal settlements have sort of converged and settled over the last 40 years, 50 years, along the tributaries of these nalas. And why did they settle there? Because if we backtrack again, there is a housing failure,
Right.
affordable housing issue all over Pakistan. So these are people who didn't have a choice. So we fast forward, we have a wash situation that is not being addressed in Karachi. And when it is addressed in a very ad hoc way. So it generally feeds into a failing situation. There's been loads of work done on this. I'm not citing anything that is new. Arif Hassan has talked about this ad nauseum for good reason. So when the 2022 floods came, or even a little earlier than that, the federal government and the local governments sort of said, well, in a nutshell, that these floods are happening because of the encroachers, that the damage is happening in the city
Right.
because of the encroachers sitting on the tributaries of these nalas. So this is
Right.
the red issue, right? That the problem was not the unprecedented precipitation. The effects were compounded by the long-standing wash issue, essentially, right?
Right.
So point number one: how to differentiate policy interventions that focus on climate impacts and those focus on very deliberate interventions that should take place in the context of long-standing water sanitation related issues which actually have not been resolved despite the interventions of engineers and the NDMA and the PDMA and the Sindh
Yeah.
government and the Supreme Court backed data. So this particular project actually is a case of maladaptation because climate change it was a red herring. It was not the source of the problem whatsoever.
Mm.
So what was the
Mm-hmm.
result? Thousands and thousands of people were evicted, which then dovetails with issue number two. If you do, since you do not have an affordable housing policy in place, and what went on under the Imran Khan government actually has created its own damage and its own resulting failures, you cannot lift people out of their homes and leave them homeless without without decent compensation that lasts beyond 2 to 3 years. You can't hand them checks. And many people in this instance were, they weren't even given checks, right? 2-3 mahine ke, 2 to 3 months, 6 months. And then just told to, you got to leave, you got to go, without any other form of. So there is a resettlement plan that has been up in the air for the last 3 years. Nothing has happened so far. So this is like an old story, right, of planning failures, resettlement. The only somewhat successful scheme that took place in Karachi was in association with the Lyari expressway construction. And there's quite a bit of work that my colleagues and I at the Karachi Urban Lab did on that. And that's part of a report that came out on land displacement. But even that involved all kinds of really, really complicated compensation schemas. So again, there's data in there that policymakers can take up to see, how do resettlement programs fail even when they are taken up considerably. In the case of the Nallas, there has been no resettlement plan that has materialized. So you go with taking up climate change related interventions, which were red herring, then you evict people without a proper plan to resettle them. So, what are you doing? You're actually creating more and more hierarchies of inequality and, of marginalization. So people are so the marginalization inequality dynamic, I believe, because of these kinds of things is deepening. I don't have data to prove it. I don't have evidence to prove this, but for me, common sense suggests that when you make people homeless, you kind of leave them in the lurch. So what are people going to do? Thirdly, jobs, livelihood systems. When these kinds of interventions take place when they ride on the wings of a climate change related intervention, which will inevitably have an impact on people's lives by displacing them, you are not just displacing their bodies, you're also displacing their livelihood systems. So typically with the Nallas in Karachi, these were the tributaries that lie in the heart of the city, and the people who've lived on the banks of these Nallas have worked in locations that are in the center of the city. So suddenly then you had people who ended up saying, well, I've had my livelihood systems attached to the center of the city. Where do I go now? Because I can't afford with this check, I can't afford rent in the city because rents in the city are too high. So I have to go, several kilometers outside of this central location, and I may not find the same kind of job over there. So this might have like a domino effect in terms of my livelihood systems, in terms of taking care of my homes, which had along the Nallas up to 7, 8, 9 people, these are high density zones. So these are the top 3 issues, and I could go on, right? I could go on about the economic issues also, but those are very pertinent to Karachi's own particular context. So I think, and all of these top 3 issues then, which result in maladaptation, severe maladaptation, then also generate new kinds of hazards and risks in people's lives, which have long-term effects. And one of them is mental anxiety. It's zehni tashaddud. It's a form of violence through this kind of an infrastructure upgradation that people have to live with for the rest of their lives. And so people talk about climate change related anxiety. This is infrastructural violence related anxiety, which then dovetails with climate change related impacts. And then, of course, opens up the very nasty and unaddressed agenda of healthcare in Pakistan, which we know in any case has been kind of shifted to the sidelines with the nominal budgets and so forth. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Nausheen. Your sort of you mentioned the mental health impacts of these almost responses to the climate change disasters or effects, or the mental health impacts of the responses to climate change disasters. There are some places within Pakistan, but also outside of Pakistan, where this has been examined very, very carefully. And, this has been studied very closely in terms of the data that's been captured in the aftermath of events like floods, extreme rains, lack of rains, droughts, but also GLOFs like glacier outbursts and so on. And so there are other contexts within Pakistan where, we do have slightly I don't know if I want to say uptake of data, but definitely data generation. So examining of the questions and looking at the responses and the data that's being generated for those questions. Are there any success stories that we can perhaps point to within Pakistan? I mean, you mentioned Punjab, you mentioned the Liari Expressway. Are there lessons where we can say, okay, in such and such context, we seem to know what to do, and we seem to be able to have sort of stronger outcomes? And this may be, you may want to answer with reference to your Nairobi experience as well. It may be the data from there that points us in a
Yes.
specific direction.
Absolutely. Actually, the Nairobi data is really quite incredible because, but so it's also a question of the kinds of institutions that are working on ground, essentially, that also make a difference, and local government systems. So if we want to, if we long for those success stories, for the positive outcomes, we also need to be aware that these positive outcomes don't just happen in a vacuum. They happen in a context where local government systems, we're talking about cities now, are also quite actively engaged with local non-governmental organizations, planners, engineers have an open mindset. This is not to suggest that in Karachi people don't have experts don't have a mindset, but the Karachi context is different because its political economy is very different and very complicated. Our local government systems have been held in abeyance for a very long time now. Certain old non-governmental organizations such as the OPP simply don't have the same ambit on ground as they once had, again, for political
Yeah.
reasons. The difference when you compare to Nairobi is that you have exceedingly active organizations over there, like the Concrete Design Initiative (KDI), which is an amalgamation of engineers, of planners, who are intervening in very specific ways on upgrading infrastructures, on flooding risk mitigation, etc., in some of Nairobi's oldest informal settlements, and they've been working there for a long time, kind of similar to what OPP did in Urangi also. But one of the things that I think that also makes KDI's work somewhat easy, I wouldn't say the word easier, but kind of facilitates is, a local government system which is willing to also collaborate, to facilitate. It's not necessarily always the case. I know that my colleagues at KDI will say, Nausheen, I think you're painting a romantic picture of how KDI works in Nairobi. But
All
when I
relative, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all relative, right? Exactly. And I've seen KDI representatives in action, literally with their hands on ground, sort of building the kind of infrastructure that is needed in some of Nairobi's informal settlements for flood risk mitigation. So I think we can take, but there are problems in Nairobi also, right? I mean, the infrastructure upgradation plans, the building of highways has caused tremendous dislocation. And whilst we were a part of this 2-year project that was funded by the British Academy, we were sitting in Nairobi and we were listening to KDI colleagues working with local communities who had been displaced as a result of these infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
We were comparing, for instance, what are the effects of the Malir Expressway to certain kinds of expressways that had been built in Nairobi. And these very shiny, sexy projects that are funded with very large sums of money. But again, when these projects are being conceived, one of the things that is not taken into consideration, and this is certainly the case of the Malir Expressway, are the environmental repercussions and the repercussions in people's lives. So Nairobi is good and bad in that sense. We see these, but there are lessons in Nairobi in terms of the institutional structure on ground that should be looked at more clearly. Well, why is it that KDI works the way it does? How does KDI succeed at working the way it does? How is it able to influence planning agendas at the local level with the Nairobi government, which is what it does, and building safe spaces for women, creating risk mitigation strategies? We need more of that in cities like Karachi and across many other cities in Pakistan. So I think that the missing ingredient over here is, and I think that many of my colleagues who are activists, who work in the non-governmental sector and who work on ground, I certainly do not have that experience, will echo this, that what we don't have in Sindh at the urban level are these really one-on-one conversations between bureaucrats, engineers, urban planners, and so forth, local citizens, ordinary citizens, and other kinds of representatives, activists, and so forth, who can work together in a way where these conversations can then lead to positive outcomes. And then there is the other side, of course. Also, you see that when you have money coming in from multilateral organizations such as the ADB and World Bank, well, the Sindh government will say, well, how can we refuse this money? It's for such and such infrastructure project. And we shouldn't refuse this money because this infrastructure project, such as the Malir Expressway, will create a great deal of harmony, and it will be an upgradation for resolving traffic issues. It will make people's lives easier. So the question then is that whose lives are made easy? Yes, of course, I have friends who take the Malir Expressway now to commute to certain other parts of the city, and they say, look, they've been putting their photographs and their videos on Twitter, and Instagram, and looking at the sunsets coming down on the Malir Expressway as they're riding comfortably in their cars. And we know that this vision serves a certain class of people. So this is where infrastructure projects also become highly classed. So they serve certain kinds of interests. So what we don't have then is kind of the other side, that what are we doing then to accommodate and provide the kinds of systems that also address the needs of those who are not privileged, who are not entitled to commute along these lines, right? So, but this is an old story, right? This is an old story of an anti-poor planning in cities like Karachi and elsewhere across Pakistan. I'm not the only one who has said this. Again, I would say Arif Hassan Saab has been talking about this for decades.
It's a very complex, it's an old story, but it's also a very complex story. And I think that sort of the elimination of grassroots involvement in decision making has been systematic, and it has it has now sort of spanned generations. But I think there's two or three things from what you just said that I think, I mean, we have a status quo and we need to operate within it, right? So we can't change the past. But looking forward, I think there's a couple of things that emerge from what you've said. One of them, of course, is the collective action and what we used to call social capital, that is now sort of in the age of social media taken on a whole new, I think, persona. But I think there's ways in which young people today are activists in a way that perhaps we had not envisioned. They have the opportunity. We have the opportunity now in the digital age that had not been thought of in the 80s or the 90s when student politics was being eliminated. So, I mean, if you think about you connect the dots. I think there's avenues that we have today that we didn't have before. Now, are they being used to the max? Perhaps not, and definitely not yet. But I think there are glimmers of hope, even in environments like Pindi and Lahore, which I know more about living in Islamabad. Karachi's history of social activism and collective action, I think, far surpasses anything that we've seen in the rest of the country. But so I would say these tools are perhaps something that that are going to be used and kind of leveraged increasingly as time goes by. And the second
Hopefully,
thing I think, sorry,
I would just like to add to that, Zainab. Sorry to interrupt. That the complexion of that has also changed. This wider history, this deeper history of collective action involving NGOs has also changed, because the donor-driven funding agenda has become very powerful, which was not the case before. And I think that, and the way that it connects with the infrastructural upgradation issue is, in my opinion, a very dangerous one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about sort of who it privileges, right? Who this infrastructure upgradation privileges. I think the question is not so much whether or not to develop the infrastructure, but I think, and this brings me to my second point, the question is how to develop it in a way that is equitable and in a way that actually factors in the marginalization and the inequality that already exists in our urban environments and in our rural environments, for that matter. So, when we talk about connecting different parts of the city, we talk about public transport. All of these questions have to be kept in mind, and to some extent, they are supposed to be kept in mind, right? I mean, we have the idea of an environmental impact assessment, which needs to be, conducted before any major project takes place, and we also know that those are not always conducted in the most thorough or, insightful of ways. Sometimes simply a paper pushing exercise or a rubber stamping exercise. So I think that's one area which can perhaps benefit from increased oversight and accountability. And that was what I was going to say on my second point. So with respect to accountability, were there things that emerged from your research in Karachi and in Nairobi, which spoke to different grassroots accountability efforts that were taking place that had actually served to enhance the way that infrastructure was being developed?
So, if we take the Malir Expressway project as an example, because that is something that we worked on because we were interested in sort of the comparative context of Nairobi and Karachi. Nairobi too was facing a similar infrastructural upgradation issue. A lot of pushback from communities, a lot of pushback from activists. Um, you know, I can think of people like Yasir Darya, from Ahmed Shabbar, so many more names, people who attended the SIPA consultation workshops with communities. Um, but the outcome remained what it remained. I mean, how do you go against the tsunami of mega bucks from funders and a Sindh government will to ensure that a sexy place, also about vote banks. It's also about this idea of I think that it also kind of gets into this whole notion of aesthetics, the aesthetics of the city. That the city is now developing. It's this frame of development that we're also so caught up in, where a certain kind of aesthetic rules, that if we have shiny expressways that clear the chaos and bring peace for commuters, that we are actually on the road to development, aside from the political connotations. How do you remove yourself from this mindset? This is a very powerful mindset.
It
And
is, yeah.
and it's a mindset that is embedded in so many different stakeholders' imaginations and their objectives, from the car manufacturing agencies to those who build the roads, to those who will benefit from the roads, to those who fund the roads, to those who have who need the political capital to be able to say that, as a governor or a chief minister,
I made that
government
road.
to open the road, and I made that road. Yeah. So, and this is not specific to Karachi. This is like a global phenomenon. And I mean, we can even go back to the United States and look at the United States history, right, and the development of its highways, which had specific kinds of stakeholders involved, right, and how that dovetailed with a certain kind of a violence. And so these are the standards that we have set in terms of development goals. So I think that the fundamental change, and I sound like I mean, I have to say that this is nothing new, but if we are to battle climate change agendas, we need to rethink how we think development. This is the fundamental issue. And I think that we are locked into, as economists would say, we have a path dependency here. So how do we kind of get out of this path dependency? And this is it's a very dangerous path dependency. We know what the repercussions are for the planet. Maybe the planet will survive after it's gotten rid of all of us. The planet will.
Right. Apocalyptic notions of survival.
Absolutely. I mean, extinction is not for the planet. Extinction is for us.
Right.
So the planet will it's time for you to get out, leave, finish. We've had enough of the Homo sapiens. Kafi ho gayi hai. But in the interim, right, when we talk about those who are marginalized and those who are poor, who are not the ones who are the carbon emitters, right, who are not the ones who benefit from all these projects, who are constantly being, shifted to the margins, how do we address their needs? And I think the fundamental issue here is that how do we kind of rethink this entire formula of development, which is, I think, really at the source of the problem.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about South-South connections, right? So you've been at IDS. I was there sort of 25 years ago, and places like IDS sort of nurture these connections, right? I mean, they're there to kind of really help these conversations take root. KDI, your conversations. There's a lot of learning that can take place across these different contexts, particularly when it comes. I was talking to a colleague recently about Indonesia. So in the Indonesian context, the way that people are involved with local government and local decision making, very different from what happens in Pakistan. Although there's a great, perhaps more diversity and varied nature of populations, and even questions of marginalization in different ways than we have to grapple with. So, what's your sense? I mean, how much do we have to gain from continuing the conversation with colleagues in other countries who are grappling with some of the same issues?
Absolutely. I mean, I've in all the projects and funding that I've been involved with now for well over 15 years now, working with partners in the South and having conversations with them has been a very important part of my learning trajectory. And so as it happens, actually, I'm bidding on a Wellcome Trust grant right now. Don't know if I'll get funded for the phase one, in which colleagues over in Nigeria who are nutritionists and myself alongside colleagues over here in Pakistan and elsewhere in Germany and other parts of the world who are physiologists, etc., and a colleague over at IDS. So we're trying to understand what is the relationship between extreme heat, undernutrition, and displacement, as it particularly affects women, female internally displaced populations. So it seems that one of the very important things that we've learned, we held workshops in Nigeria and we held workshops in Pakistan in the phase one of this particular project, where we won a small grant from the Wellcome Trust. And one of the things that came up through our conversations in Abuja, for instance, with NGOs and INGOs and humanitarian relief organizations, as well as in Pakistan, so these were cross-fertile conversations, was that inadequate access to potable water has a huge effect on women's lives, and in turn, possibly on breastfeeding and then children's nutrition. So through these conversations, these South-to-South conversations, we have ended up rethinking the model for how we think about the relationship between extreme heat and undernutrition, putting inadequate access to potable water as one of the key pathways to think about these relationships. Whilst it might seem almost commonsensical, but there is actually very little, no evidence out there. And we did a massive literature review using a very sophisticated technology to see if there was any literature out there that linked extreme heat and undernutrition together. None whatsoever, or very to start off with, and hardly anything on potable water. So these kinds of conversations, so this kind of research and the desire for us to delve into this kind of research and then think about its policy implications came from these South-to-South conversations. And so there is this angle from these South-to-South connections, which is research related. And then, of course, it inevitably, the trajectory then dives into the policy-related implications, and then thinking about, well, in Nigeria, these are the kinds of institutions that are part of the landscape where Dr. X or Y would engage. Then what are the similar kinds of institutions in Pakistan?
What are the parallels?
Yeah, what are the parallels? So this is actually precisely the same thing I'm supposed to be sorting out today as we start uploading the application on the portal. So I reached out to my colleague, Dr. Amna Rehana Siddiqui over at JPNU, who's a leading epidemiologist and works on nutrition. The Dr. Amna, did you see so-and-so's list? Do we have something comparable for Pakistan? Because that was a really comprehensive list. So this is, these often seem like, well, what's the big deal? But actually, this is where the learning also happens. This is also where you start making a difference. So I'm not at IDS anymore. I'm now affiliated also with IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, as a part of their Human Settlements Group. And IIED, of course, has a long legacy of doing absolutely outstanding work on policy-related impacts and working at the community level. And and right now they're doing so as part of the Human Settlements Group. I'm working alongside colleagues who are doing outstanding work on issues of risk and resilience. And then I'm constantly being asked, how do you actually then translate all of this down to the local level? Who are you engaging with at the local level? What are the cross-cutting themes across cities and different geographical locations? So, and this is exactly the kind of accountability that a person like me needs, right? Sometimes I might operate in the realm of academic research, but how do we then make our research, how do we make a difference? As academics, we always say we never make a difference except in the classroom. But then when we work alongside such amazing colleagues in institutions like IID, we can possibly find pathways to make a difference at the policy level.
I smile because at Tabadlab, I'm kept honest by that. So at Tabadlab, it's all about having that policy conversation. And there's a great deal of emphasis that we place on making sure that our research findings are heard and, that the uptake is significant. And significant doesn't always mean, an earth-shattering change the next day. Significant sometimes means just shifting the needle in how one policymaker is, viewing his or her agenda, for tomorrow. Sometimes that's just the only impact that we can take, but we'll take it, right? We'll take whatever little we can get because it's evidence-based and it's backed. And I think that any little win is a win in our context. So it's been fabulous talking with you, Dr. Nausheen. You have an extremely rich set of data here, and I hope that this will sort of lead to, and not just from this paper, but from the varied work that you've been doing. And I'm sure this will lead to sort of many more interesting conversations, particularly given your upcoming work. I'll say that your upcoming work on malnutrition and maternal health. I look forward to speaking to you again, and I hope that next time around we will have a slightly more optimistic conversation in terms of the policy implications and the resonance of our research and connections with those who are making the decisions in this context.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Zainab. It's been an honor. Really
Absolutely.
had.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much, Nausheen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.